Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire, supported by Glenlivet Books. How significant is last week's announcement that both Indian and Chinese forces are disengaging and withdrawing from both banks of Pangong Lake? Or do we need to answer further critical questions before we can come to a clear judgment? And secondly, what has been the impact of India's problem with China on India's image and standing in South Asia? Those are two critical issues that I shall put today to someone whose view is widely respected. He is India's former National Security Advisor, former Foreign Secretary, former Ambassador to China, and former High Commissioner to Pakistan, Shivshankar Menon. Mr. Menon, let's start with last week's announcement that Indian and Chinese forces have started withdrawing and disengaging from both banks of Pangong Lake. No doubt this will reduce the temperature and lower the tension. But let me begin with a general question. Do you believe that this withdrawal is significant?
I believe it's potentially significant because it's only the first step and it's still nowhere near a full disengagement or an agreement on what we should be doing. North of Pangong Tso, we seem to have both agreed to respect each other's LAC in effect and demilitarize the area in between, which creates a demilitarized zone, a sort of buffer area, buffer zone, which neither side will enter militarily. And that, frankly, the Chinese have conceded that they will not patrol up to Finger 3 as they used to in the past. And we have conceded that we won't patrol up to Finger 8 as we used to in the past. So that is a good first step. It prevents accidents, mistakes because of contiguity, because of people rubbing up against each other, patrols meeting, and so on. It's a first step. What's happening south of Pangong Tso is not quite clear to me. There is talk of our withdrawing from the heights we occupied in August, September. If so, we don't know whether there's some quid pro quo on the Chinese side. We don't know what the other arrangements are, what else was discussed. So I'd be a little careful before jumping to conclusions. So it's still only potential.
Okay.
Potential because ultimately we need much more. We need more than just disengagement. We need a return to the positions before April.
Absolutely. Let's take this step by step and let's first talk about what's happened on the north bank of Pangong Lake. As you said, India will be restricted to Finger 3. It's agreed it will not patrol up to Finger 8, which was the outer limit of its LAC claim. Similarly, China has restricted itself on Finger 8 and will not patrol up to Finger 3, which was China's outer limit of the LAC. Now, speaking in Parliament, this is what the Defense Minister said. I want to assure this House that in these talks, we have not conceded anything. His exact words were, we have not conceded anything. But it's quite clear that both sides have actually made concessions. India has conceded it won't patrol from Finger 3 to Finger 8, or rather Finger 4 to Finger 8. China has conceded it won't patrol from Finger 8 to Finger 3. So the truth is not that India hasn't conceded anything, but that both sides have made matching concessions.
That's how it appears to me. Because after all, concessions are the essence of negotiation. I mean, you give something, you get something, and both sides give something, get something. That's a negotiation. But frankly, you can't expect the RM to say anything different because the government's stand has always taken the public position that the Chinese were held, Chinese never advanced, we have not lost control of any territory to them. And if you start from that assumption, then you have not conceded anything to them.
Absolutely. Can I just point out?
Not what everybody agrees as...
Mr. Menon, we've conceded nothing in terms of territory, but the Defense Minister in his statement didn't use the word territory. His words were, we have not conceded anything. Actually, we've conceded the right to patrol up to the outer limit of the LAC, as we see it, and China's made a matching concession. So the truth is, we haven't conceded territory, but we have conceded the right to patrol for a while.
Temporarily, until other arrangements are put in place, etc. There's a whole lot of qualifications there, which I suppose he would say, that's not a big concession. Okay. That's not a concession.
Let me bring up a different point made by former Defense Minister A.K. Antony. He says that the entire buffer zone on Pangong, and I presume he's talking about the North Bank, is on Indian territory. Those were his words, Indian territory. I suppose what he means is territory that India had control of or patrolled up to. Last year, and again, this is a point made by Mr. Antony, a buffer zone was created in Galwan, and that too, Mr. Antony claims, was on what he calls Indian territory, territory that India could patrol up to. In addition, newspaper reports last year pointed out that in fact, Indian soldiers had been pushed some 2.4 kilometers away from PP-14, which is the traditional marker for the LAC, whereas the Chinese were virtually still at PP-14. So do you agree with Mr. Antony's point that both the withdrawal on the north bank of Pangong, as well as the earlier withdrawal last year at Galwan, have happened in terms and in ways that is disadvantageous to India, it's more advantageous to China?
Well, 2 points. One is, I wish he hadn't used the word Indian territory, because all of Aksai Chin is Indian territory. Even the parts that China has occupied for some years. Those are all Indian territory. So whatever happens here is actually happening on Indian territory. It's not about Indian territory. It's about territory that we had controlled and patrolled up to. What it seems to me, if you accept RM's version that the Chinese have not come forward, then, it's difficult to make sense of what's going on. Then why are we negotiating a disengagement? What is being discussed? But if you accept the general opinion around the world by independent observers, people who look at satellite pictures and so on, that the Chinese did actually move forward, prevented us from patrolling where we used to patrol, and therefore had moved forward, then it seems to me that you're still within the standard Chinese playbook, which they've applied in the South China Sea elsewhere, where they take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back with a net gain. And I think that's the point that Mr. Antony is probably trying to make, that disengagement from the present position, which is already changed in China's favor, and an equal disengagement would actually leave the Chinese with net gains. But we don't know enough about what's agreed. And frankly, so far, it's only one small, tiny area where they've agreed.
Absolutely. But what's your personal opinion? Do you believe this amounts to 2 steps forward, 1 step back for China, which leaves China with a 1-step net gain? Do you believe that?
If we withdrawn south of Pangong Tso as part of creating this buffer zone north of Pangong Tso, yes, there's a net gain for China. Because they have in effect demilitarized an area which was under your control where you were sitting and demilitarized it of you. So in a sense, yes, I do think that would be, but we're speculating here.
Absolutely, but I'm just clarifying what you said because it's very important. If you look only at the North Bank and not the South Bank, then there you have a situation where both sides have made matching concessions. India hasn't lost, China hasn't gained. But if you throw into the mix the belief that we have demilitarized or withdrawn from the Chushul Heights and the Kailash range on the South Bank, then that is clearly an instance of India making a move or a concession not matched by any response from China.
We don't know enough. We don't know what the endpoint to which the Chinese are withdrawing is, which would explain whether or not you were willing to withdraw off the heights. So frankly, we have done this in the past. We have previously, in other cases, when the Chinese moved in and sat on territory that we controlled, we have actually moved in and occupied some territory elsewhere and then traded it and asked the Chinese to go back. And we have also...
But that hasn't happened here. As far as we know, that hasn't happened here.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm very nervous, very careful about actually jumping to a conclusion yet.
Absolutely. But what you're saying is that we can only be sure India hasn't made a concession on the South Bank when we know the end result. At the moment, we don't. And so at the moment, there are question marks about what happened on the South Bank. The initial impression is that the Indian decision to demilitarize or withdraw from the Kailash range and the Chushul heights looks like a concession made by India without an immediate responding concession from China. At the moment, that's how it looks, but we need to know more before we can come to a firm conclusion. Is that right?
I don't like coming to conclusions now.
Okay.
You're not even in the middle of a process. You're just at the beginning of an opaque process. So I am very nervous about jumping to conclusions. I know there are lots of people who are absolutely sure about what's going on and are pontificating in the media. I'm not going to.
We're saying the same thing. We're both saying we can't come to a conclusion, but we are agreeing that there are question marks, important question marks about what has happened on the South Bank. And unless we know what the Chinese response is, there will be some doubts about the fact that India has vacated the Kailash range as well as the Chushul heights. We don't know what we're getting in return. We need to find out. Now, let's come to two other areas where the Chinese intrusion up till now continues, and we still need to negotiate the withdrawal. First, let's talk about hot springs and Gogra. Last year in July, newspapers and television channels quoting unnamed military sources claimed all over their front pages that in fact a negotiation had led to withdrawal at Hot Spring and Gogra, and that turned out to be completely false. Now that we are hoping to negotiate a genuine withdrawal, how easy or difficult will it be at Hot Springs and Gogra?
Well, not just Hot Springs and Gogra, but in Depsang as well, which I think is a slightly more complicated problem. It will be difficult and it will be complicated. But, you know, I want to make a more general point. Our experience of buffer zones, of disengagement, of demilitarized zones with the Chinese goes all the way back to Barahoti in 1958. It was true in Longju as well. In various areas, we have tried solutions like this. In fact, in none of them have they really worked. They might have postponed the problem, but unless they're followed up by a much more general agreement of how we will behave on the LAC and on maintaining the status quo, and then respect it and implement it, both sides, it's very difficult to see these small measures as actually solving the problem.
In other words, buffer zones are just an interim exercise. They need to be followed by much more substantive, well-negotiated, detailed agreements. In the absence of those, we have no idea how long-lasting this is as a solution. It's probably just a very interim, temporary step.
Exactly. These are tools, and they're blunt tools.
But you did say that of the areas from where Chinese intrusion needs to be vacated, Hot Springs and Gogra being one, Depsang being the other, you believe Depsang will be the more tricky. Is that because, A, the Chinese intrusion is as deep as 15, 18 kilometers into Indian previously controlled, patrolled territory? Or is it also because Depsang gives access to the critical airport at Daulat Beg Oldi?
I think the airport, I think, is still quite some distance away from where the Chinese are. But I think the real problem in Depsang, subsector north, is that the Chinese have always been much more interested in that. This is not the first time that the Chinese have tried to change the status quo in their favor. They tried building a road in Butse earlier. They came into Depsang in 2013. This is a running problem because of the sensitive and strategic nature of that territory. This is close to, and it actually brings us to the area where the India, China, Karakoram Pass, and on the other side, Pakistan, and near Siachen. So this is an area of extreme strategic sensitivity, which the Chinese have consistently displayed an interest in changing the status quo. This is not new. They've been trying this for a long time, and they've been held off in various ways. So it's going to be a more complicated negotiation for that reason.
Tell me something. Assuming we are able to correctly and satisfactorily ensure a withdrawal at Depsang as well as Hot Springs Gogra, we believe we've achieved something fairly substantial on the North Bank. How easy will it be thereafter to push the Chinese forces and, more importantly, the heavy equipment back to their original bases much further back?
You know, the question really is then, why did they do what they did last year?
We don't know.
If we don't know that, we don't know how easy it'll be to actually get them back, because it's a fairly silent, it's a big decision to actually have changed the status quo, thrown all the agreements overboard, created mistrust, which is not going to be wiped away just by going back to your earlier positions. So given the fact that we are not certain why they chose to do this, we will have to, well, find our way across the river looking for stones underfoot, as Deng Xiaoping used to say.
This
We
is
will
very
have
interesting. Because we don't know why the Chinese did it, we won't know how far they're prepared to go in terms of their withdrawal and disengagement. And as you said, this is like crossing a river by feeling the stones under your feet as you go along. Every step will determine what the next would be.
And I think this is going to be a long, complicated process. But I have made the point also that this time, the Chinese have been framing it in their propaganda as a sovereignty issue, not as a dispute, which makes a big difference. A dispute is something that you give and take and arrive at a settlement on, where you can make concessions. Sovereignty is not something you can trade or that you can make concessions on easily. So my own expectation is that this is going to be a much harder negotiation than the ones we've had in the past, when the Chinese chose to frame it as disputes, which had to be resolved.
Very interesting. This is a much harder negotiation than any of the others we've had in the past. In other words, this time.
Well, recent past. I mean, I'm not counting the 50s here. 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about what happened in 2013. You're talking about what happened in 2015. This is much more difficult. Let me put this to you. The announcement, when it was made last Wednesday, Thursday, came as quite a surprise to people in India. After months of intransigence, and after Chinese simply stonewalling on practically every suggestion made by the Indian side, why do you think they suddenly agreed to this withdrawal process? What changed?
You know, I don't think we should confuse tactics with strategy. We've gone through this process before. In July 1962, for instance, the Chinese chose to withdraw in various areas, including Galwan, where they were face-to-face with Indian posts. And everybody in India declared victory and said, look, we've got them back. 4 months later, we were in a war with them. And a war that China had spent at least 2.5 years preparing for, bringing in supplies and so on. Tibet was not well connected in those days. Their infrastructure wasn't developed. So I do think there's a risk here where we take the temperature every day, where we start declaring victory, we start drawing big conclusions about why the Chinese did it, about we're winning, they're winning, oh, they've lost their nerve, oh, they miscalculated. I really think we should stay away from that kind of statement when we're just at the beginning of a process. And this is why I say, feel the stones. Don't draw big conclusions about this. This is a tactical withdrawal, and it's temporary on both sides.
What about the view, and it's been expressed fairly by people who understand China very well, let me put it like that, that China had miscalculated, that China had bitten off more than it can chew, and that China was now looking for a way to extricate itself. Would you accept that?
I'm impressed by their confidence, because since we just said earlier, we don't know what their calculation was. How do we know they miscalculated? But I'm impressed by the confidence of people who know exactly why the Chinese did it and how they did it, and who know exactly that they miscalculated. I'm very impressed by that. I frankly don't hold to any of these. As I said, you cannot take the temperature every minute and draw huge strategic conclusions like that.
Now,
you can make general statements about Chinese behavior. China responds to the relative balance of power and her perception of the relative balance of power.
Now, assuming over the next few weeks that in fact the disengagement and withdrawal goes as we all in India hope it will, and that the two armies return to the positions they occupied in April 2020, would that be a moment for the relationship between Delhi and Beijing to go back to what it was pre-2020, or would that be a mistake? Do we now need a fairly thorough recalibration of the relationship?
Well, I've been talking since last year of the need to reset the relationship. I don't think there's any going back. After all, after what the Chinese have done in the summer of 2020, I don't think we can just ignore that and say, oh, everything's back to normal and here we go again. Peace and tranquility, as the government EM remind us, is the basis on which the rest of the relationship actually has worked. And that is in question now. And the old framework, which had brought peace and tranquility, has been torn up by Chinese actions last year. So we need a new framework for the relationship, and we need to reset that relationship. We can't do it alone. We'll have to do it with the Chinese. And it's going to take all kinds of complicated and difficult conversations. But I think there's no avoiding that. So for me, there's no going back.
But when you say it will take all sorts of difficult and complicated conversations, you're also saying that the new relationship will take a fairly long time to emerge. It's not something that's going to suddenly happen overnight. It will emerge over a process of months, if not years.
It depends. I mean, on the levels of clarity that both sides are willing to bring to the table, describing their core interests, describing what they are willing to trade, and describing what they are willing to adjust, where they are willing to work with each other. And ultimately, the judgment on both sides that the other side is sincere or not in what it's saying. Now, that's the question, because after what happened last year on the border, that sincerity is in question.
In other words, China has to prove its sincerity once again. They have to give us proof that they're sincere, that they will not do what they've done again, and only then can the relationship begin to develop. But even so, it won't be going back to the old relationship, it will be a new one. But the new one itself is dependent upon China proving its sincerity.
On peace and tranquility on the border, I think that is an essential condition. And then the rest of it, the adjustment of interests, etc.
Let's at this point broaden our conversation. What do you believe has been the impact of India's China problem and the way the Indian government handled it on India's standing and image in South Asia?
Well, I don't think it has helped us. Whether you look at the Nepalese media, the Bangladeshi media, the Sri Lankan media, it had a very different account of what was happening from what was in our official versions or in what was being leaked or spun so consistently through the summer and winter, actually, in our media. Governments are always too polite to say what they really think. But I think you can see it in the behavior of the Nepalese government, of the others. If the National University of Singapore, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, did a survey among all the Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries, and the levels of trust in China, of course, have dropped, but levels of trust in India have also shrunk and are very low after all these years of look east, act east. So in other words, and I don't think it's only India, China, it's also COVID, it's the world economy, it's a whole set of things working together, which have actually diminished all of us, all the great powers, our reputation, and also our ability to actually create outcomes.
Okay.
So, and this is true of India, it's true of the Chinese government, it's true of all, certainly it was true of the Trump administration.
Let's look at the key neighboring countries and the relationship with India and the way in which this China situation has affected it one by one. As you know, Indian analysts for decades have talked about how India would handle a two-front warlike situation. We virtually had that on our doorstep last year. If the conclusion is that China is the greater worry, are there now grounds today for considering a re-engagement with Pakistan?
I don't think Pakistan is the key to your China problem. I mean, even if you had wonderful relations with Pakistan, nothing would change on the China border. Not necessarily. I mean, so for me, Pakistan is a sideshow. You have a China problem, which you have to deal with. And that's something that we need to address straight on. Not just, on the border in military terms, but politically, economically, in terms of soft power, in terms of our influence, in terms of working with others, external balancing. So there's a whole host of things that I think we need to factor into a China strategy.
Now, what about a different issue? Can India play a bigger role in Asia, a bigger role internationally, which clearly the Modi government and previous governments also have wanted to do, if Pakistan keeps drawing us back into South Asia and keeps limiting the way the world perceives us? Is that not another reason for...
I don't think Pakistan draws you back into South Asia. It's your obsession with Pakistan which actually drags you back. And today we seem to be in a position where actually a certain managed level of hostility seems to work for both sides, for both Pakistan and India. But that's a different issue. I don't think Pakistan has anything to do with your role in Asia. It is what you choose to do in Asia. If you walk away from RCEP, if your economic engagement does not match the hype and the promise that you make, then frankly, no amount of political, military, defense, security links can actually carry that relationship. You can't walk on one leg.
Okay.
You need to have a comprehensive approach to Asia, and Asia is the future. But if you're going to close yourself off economically, heading for autarky or self-reliance or Atmanirbhar or whatever you call it, raise tariffs for 4 years running, then frankly, they will lose interest and look elsewhere.
That's a very clear answer. China has also begun to affect India's relationship with Sri Lanka, with Nepal, both of which you pointed out, to a lesser extent also with Bangladesh. In fact, there is a view that Chinese influence in Rajapaksa's Sri Lanka or Oli's Nepal is perhaps greater today than Indian influence. A, would you agree? And B, what should we do about it if that's the case?
A, I disagree. Because if you look at the kinds of affinities, the kinds of linkages we have with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, with Nepal, it's really, there is no comparison in what China does. What China does is, with a political elite, is it has economic power, but it doesn't have the rest yet. Maybe it's trying to build it. B, please don't underestimate this very strong sense of nationalism, their sense of independence of the Sri Lankans, the Bangladeshis, the Nepalese. They will play you and the Chinese. And the worse your relationship is with the Chinese, the more they will play each of you against each other to get what they want. The same is true of Myanmar, where I think the West and others consistently underestimate. It doesn't matter whether it's Aung San Suu Kyi or whether it's Tatmadaw, the army. They have you've seen Burmese nationalism over the years and how strong it is. And you need to work with that.
I'll come to Burma in a minute, but are you...
What I'm saying is you need to work with that. You need to work with that sense of independence.
I'll come to Burma in a minute, but are you saying with regard to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, that in fact China cannot rival or outmatch India's influence in these three countries? That these countries may play us one against another because it suits them to do so, but the role and size and scale of India's influence cannot be overtaken by China?
If you're clever, if you don't go around calling them termites, if you make yourself essential to their prosperity, which is not difficult, given the size of your economy and its sophistication, and you make yourself a source of security and stability in the subcontinent. These are things you have to work at, and you have to be conscious of that.
Let's then come to Burma. As you know, there's been a coup, a very serious sea change has taken place in the political situation in that country. And it's quite clear that the Burmese generals who've acquired power will be relying upon China for international protection, and particularly at the UN. India, over the last 6 years, have developed a close relationship both with the Tatmadaw, which is the Burmese army, as well as with Aung San Suu Kyi. How does this coup affect India's relationship with Burma?
Well, you notice the government of India didn't call it coup. They've spoken, officially, they've only spoken of developments in Myanmar. And I think what we will do is we will work with whoever's in power in Myanmar. We have in the past, we will in the future. Where we haven't, our interests have suffered. Because we do have interests. We have an interest in a peaceful Myanmar. We have cross-border ethnicities. We have Indian insurgent groups which use ungoverned spaces in Myanmar and which have been used by other powers. They've been armed by Chinese and so on. So we have interests there in Myanmar. Myanmar is our access to Southeast Asia, land access. So we do need to work with whoever's there. And we have done so in the past from day one.
But
Nehru's government just
are you worried?
Made military aid to them.
Are you worried that because of the close support that the generals are getting from China, this is one country where China's influence could grow, perhaps at India's cost?
If we ignore them and isolate them, certainly that's guaranteed. That's exactly what happened in 1988 onwards, until we re-engaged in the mid-90s. And if the world chooses to isolate them and push them into the Chinese arms, yes, that's what will happen. But that's not inevitable, and not at all. If the Chinese are going to save their bacon in the UN, good luck to them. Why does it worry us? How does it hurt us? I don't see that as being a worry for us. We should worry about our actual interests in Myanmar and those not being affected.
Let's then, as we approach the end of this interview, talk briefly about India-US relations, particularly now that America has a new president. Now, beyond doubt, Joe Biden's top priorities are going to be COVID, the economy, the deep racial divide that threatens to split his country, and the threat that American democracy faces from Trump supporters. How high in priority, given the challenges he already has, is India?
We don't have to be a very high priority, but I do think that we do fit into his priorities. Climate change is one of his priorities, and that's something where we have a lot to contribute. In the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and so on is another area where you've heard the new administration speaking about its importance, rebalance. China is very high on its priorities, and India is a part of US calculations on China, on how to deal with China. So frankly, we remain what we were. We still have a congruence of interest with the US, which is actually growing steadily. We need each other. We need the US for our own transformation, for our own economic and other development, and we will work together. I know people worry about, what about the progressives and the Democrats, and what about their commitment to democracy and the criticism that we've heard from some members of Congress and so on. Yes, but we've lived with that before, and we will live with it in the future. We have to get used to this. This is an open, globalized world, but we need to concentrate on the good bits. And frankly, President Biden himself knows India well, came to India as vice president, was most helpful when we worked together, when he was in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, when he was in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. And throughout the process of building bilateral consensus in the US on improving India-US relations, he was a great help. The professionals he's appointed.
No, but hang on, let's take this one by one. Are you saying that President Biden, who, as you correctly pointed out, was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when the Indo-US nuclear deal was happening, and you were foreign secretary at the time, and he was vice president under Obama when you were NSA at the time. Are you saying that this is an American president who understands India? That he's aware of the different nuances of our relationship with our neighbors, with China, our interests, our economy? Is he therefore well versed in India?
I think there hasn't been a US president since George H.W. Bush, I mean the father, who had better knowledge of the rest of the world. And there hasn't been a president so far who was more familiar with India than President Biden when he came to office.
There hasn't been a president more familiar with India.
There hasn't been a US president before this, ever. And if you look at those he's appointed to critical positions, Bill Burns in the CIA, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, NSA, look at Kurt Campbell, who's going to do Indo-Pacific. all of them know India, have been here. We've been working with them for years. They're thorough professionals. So even if the advantage is they know us, even if they have opinions, whatever, as long as they follow the US interest and we follow our interest, I think this relationship will do well.
Okay.
And you have the added advantage, though, of knowledge, of familiarity with the people, of the fact that they're professionals. And that is a big thing.
The new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was Deputy National Security Advisor when you were India's National Security Advisor. Did you get to know him well at that time? And if you did, what is your view of him?
We've met and worked together. And as I said, he's a thorough professional. And what is good is that he also has a relatively open mind. But frankly, for me, most important is that the unpredictability that we had in the Trump administration and the lack of structure, the lack of process, that I don't think we will face now with the Biden administration.
You say that there will be less unpredictability, there will be more structure, more process. Let me put to you something that you've hinted at anyway in your answers, the fact that Biden has a very strong moral commitment to democracy, to human rights. He's even planning a summit of democracies. Is it a concern or a fear to India that he might repeatedly raise India's treatment of Muslims, of Kashmir, of NGOs, of the media, all of which are perceived not just at home, but internationally as Mr. Modi's Achilles heel? And almost as we speak, there are articles in Time magazine that are pointing out that, in fact, it will be very hard for Mr. Biden not to talk about these issues, and they will make Modi squirm when he does.
Well, he might speak, certainly, and I think this administration will be much more vocal about these sorts of issues. But ultimately, US policy, Indian policy should be guided by interests, not by preferences, by norms, by the idea of exporting democracy and so on. So I am not so sure that this is going to affect the nature of the relationship unless we make the mistake of personalizing it and of taking these things seriously. What do I mean by the mistake of taking it seriously? If Rihanna tweets, there's no need for the Indian state to respond. I mean, this is some pop singer, you know. So we need to stop being sensitive. We now live in a globalized world where people have opinions and have the means to express them on everything. So let them. We're a democracy.
Mr. Menon, Mr. Menon, we're not talking about Rihanna or Greta Thunberg tweeting and India overreacting. We're talking of the possibility, it is only a possibility, that a summit of democracies will be held by the American president, and he may not invite India because although electorally we continue to be like a democracy, as the Time magazine article points out, and there are several in other American papers like New York Times and Washington Post, our behavior thereafter is to undermine freedoms of expression, freedom of protest, the freedom of organization, our treatment of farmers, our treatment of Muslims, our treatment of Kashmir. All of those could be reasons either to leave India out or to talk critically of India in a way that embarrasses the government. Will that not affect the relationship if it happens?
I think what you're saying about leaving India out and so on is highly hypothetical. And I think it's good stuff for newspaper articles and maybe for their circulation as well. But frankly, I don't want to even go there. The issues themselves that you mentioned are issues that we need to sort out for ourselves. These are Indian issues which Indians have to sort out among ourselves. And they are issues. We can't deny that. But we also need to stop being so sensitive about what other people say. They will say. They have said in the past, they will say in the future. But we can't treat everything as a plot to overthrow India. And we cannot identify government with the state of India, with the country of India. We can't treat each of these things. This is a globalized world where everybody will express their opinions, whether they're in government or out of it. And I think we need to actually concentrate on the more important things. We should keep our eye on the ball rather than getting distracted by these things. We have other significant interests in the relationship with the US, which should take priority in our view, and which is what we should be working on.
All right, Mr. Menon, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for this comprehensive interview. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan. Thank you very much. Enjoyed that.